So we are very honored today to have some leaders today in establishing community land trusts, right? There are community land trusts being built across Canada, and these folks are leading organizations that are at the leading edge of that progress to establish community land trusts. I think it's really important also to acknowledge again, the fact that community land trusts are something that has come through innovations of the Black community in response to a system that was not designed for us. And so in working together, we have created this system where we can together maintain and own land. And so while these are individual efforts and community efforts in far along neighborhoods across Canada, we are united by that shared history and that shared vision for Black people to have and sustain their protected access to affordable housing, and through that, their ability to thrive and to really invest and to enjoy the beauty that is Black culture. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Curtis Wiley from the Upper Hammonds Plains CLT. He is the founder, and I'll leave it to him to introduce further his work and the work of the Upper Hammonds Plains CLT. Curtis?
Thanks, Cheryl, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll just get my presentation started. All right. So I'm honored to be here today to talk about some of the work of Upper Hammonds Plains Community Land Trust, to share, a bit more about myself and a bit more about my community. So the Upper Hammonds Plains Community Land Trust was founded out of necessity, and I'll explain that. But I wanted to start with our mission statement, which is our goal is to create a legacy of wealth and stability for Black communities through the responsible stewardship of land. And we will work to build a future where Black families and individuals have access to affordable housing, economic opportunity, and the tools they need to build intergenerational wealth. So for my presentation, I'm going to have to take us back before we can get to kind of where we are now, because the history really matters, in particular in Nova Scotia. So for myself, essentially, I started working for the province's housing organization, which was Housing Nova Scotia. I worked there for several years as a housing navigator, and I delivered housing programs. And then there was basically situations where I couldn't help certain people, Black people that lived in historical African Nova Scotian communities, because you had to own your own home. And then I discovered there was Black people that didn't actually own the homes they lived in, and that they had these title issues that dated back to, the late 1700s, early 1800s in some cases. So I joined the Land Titles Initiative, worked on that project for a while. Then during COVID, I went to Nunavut and worked for the Nunavut Housing Corporation. And now I'm back on the Land Titles Initiative, leading one of the divisions within this project. And so the Land Titles Initiative is where I've learned a lot about land, and how it can be leveraged for community benefit, or how it could be. So that's kind of the separation, is that I do Land Titles Initiative work through my day work, but then I do, community land trust, community mobilization work as a volunteer. And so today's roadmap, I'm going to talk about Upper Hammonds Plains and the history. I'll show you kind of the community's land, what the landscape looks like there. We'll talk a bit about development, how this concept of community land trust, in particular in Nova Scotia, will be very valuable as it pertains to African Nova Scotian communities, a bit about what we're doing and what we've done, and our path forward. So this is the welcome to Upper Hammonds Plains. This is the municipal sign. And so we recently had added to it this second piece, which, proclaims that it is an African heritage, or a Black heritage community that's over 200 years old. So in terms of a lot of the, so for everyone's understanding, most of the African Nova Scotian communities, there are over 52 in Nova Scotia, have a similar history to Upper Hammonds Plains. But the story for Upper Hammonds Plains settlement is that after the War of 1812, the government of Nova Scotia was looking for a place to grant land for the Chesapeake Blacks who had escaped, or in some cases were stolen from slavery to fight in the war. And so there's a promise made to the former slaves that they would be granted land at the end of the war. And so one of the areas chosen was lands directly north of the village of Hammonds Plains, which later became known as Upper Hammonds Plains. And so in 1834, some of the settlers, so there was an original land grant for the folks that fought in the war, but then there was also times afterwards where our ancestors purchased land. And so that's what happened in 1864. And you can see here, like, this name is actually the name of my great grandfather, who was Deal Wiley. So I'm a 6th generation African Nova Scotian. And so we can trace our history back to these original land grants. And that's what gives us such a deep sense of rootedness in our communities and why we're fighting so hard to protect them. But as with most Blacks that were forced to live in isolated areas, talking about Deal, they were faced with very significant hardships, tough living conditions. Black people were put in remote locations by design. We were put there to fail. But that's not what happened. In Upper Hammonds Plains, the area had mature forests. And so my grandfather and some others had come from Virginia, and they were coopers. So they started making barrels, and then they were industrious and kept going with the lumbering and timbering. So that's kind of how our community began. And that's how it developed, and over time it grew. And so by 1970, Upper Hammonds Plains was almost exclusively a Black population, with a population of 500. And then the Upper Hammonds Plains Community Development Association was created, which provides programs and services. And then the Melvin Land Tract Protection Society is of particular importance for our community, because that group oversees a tract of land, which we'll get to, which is approximately 1,100 acres of land that was granted to the community. So we'll move into those slides. So the community's land, so this is a map of Halifax, HRM, and Dartmouth. And so Upper Hammonds Plains is located approximately 25 kilometers northwest of downtown Halifax. And when we look at Upper Hammonds Plains in particular, the community essentially is one long road, which is the Pockwalk Road, and it goes north. And so the yellow parcels are the Melvin Land Tract. It used to be larger, so it used to also include this piece, but we'll talk about what happened with that. And so there's a number of different parcels and parcel types. You can see here, these are still in the names of the original settlers. So you can see it's the 10 acres and a mule type of situation. They're uniform in shape, but it also means that these parcels have never been able to be leveraged for community benefit. So we'll move on to development. So there's a lot of development that's happening in Upper Hammonds Plains because of the zoning. And so, as we know, systemic racism has caused centuries of inequality, and this has compounded most powerfully through land and housing. Since most wealth generation in our country is generated through equity, this means that there's a smaller number of community members that have the capacity to purchase property or to finance developments. And so, further to that, the GU1 zoning, which was really open zoning, which is put in place for us to have more uses over our parcels, has in recent years made way for outside developers or outside investors to come in and leverage that zoning for their own benefit. So they're developing a significant amount in our community. And so you can see images here of the types of developments that they're doing, and then they're selling the whole properties or they're renting them, and the rents are really high. They're about over $2,000 for a 2-bedroom. And this would be considered a rural area. And then we see businesses like the picture on the right, which shows, auto salvage yards, because the zoning allows for kind of open uses. The other thing that we see happening is that developers will buy parcels, subdivide the parcel, and then, put out proposals for large scale developments to happen on them. So if we're thinking about the context of a community land trust, and we're thinking about the province in general, because our 52 African Nova Scotian communities are land-based, that's why this model will be so powerful for our communities, right? Because they are based on land, and there is history that ties our geographical locations to our communities. And that's how we know each other. We basically, when we meet each other, say, what community are you from, right? And you can basically tell by someone's surname or where they're from, like what connections. That's kind of where you jump off when you meet somebody new, who's African Nova Scotian, or it has those long historical ties to one of these communities. So here you can see a map of kind of where all the communities are. And so our communities have few examples of affordable housing or social housing that we would expect to find across the housing continuum, but we have this kind of capacity to be able to do it if we can gain possession of land parcels in our communities. And so that is one of the primary missions of our community land trust in particular. So what have we done? The Upper Hammonds Plains Community Land Trust was founded last February in 2022. And since then, we've been very busy with a number of different projects, but essentially it comes down to a couple of key areas, which are community mobilization, rezoning, and building strategic partnerships. So of course, I had this idea that we were going to get, we were going to bound and we were all of a sudden we were going to be developing, but we realized that that wasn't going to be the case. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of getting everyone on the same page and promoting this model. And so that's really been what's been driving a lot of our work. In the first bit of our project, we did receive funding from the provincial government, from Housing Nova Scotia. So we were able to hire some consultants and get our website created and do a couple of other activities in terms of long range planning. And so that's a big one. The rezoning was a huge one for us. So we began that process even before the trust was formed, and we were able to successfully rezone the community. So we downgraded the zoning. There was essentially 1,150 units that were pending approval. We were able to prevent 500 of those units from getting developed because they happen as of right. So they don't involve the community when they happen, but 700 units will still be built. And there's only 2,500 single family homes in the community. So there's a substantial amount of development happening without our input. And then the last thing was, well, it's the strategic partnership. So that land, the Melvin Land Tract, 300 acres of that was expropriated in 1974 to make way for the Pockwalk water plant. And so what happened was that the government expropriated the land, built a water treatment facility, and we actually didn't get access to that clean water for 25 years until 1999, after our community filed a class action lawsuit against Halifax Water. So they took the land, built the thing, but didn't give us access to the clean drinking water that ran right through our backyards. Right. And so our water was still brown and it was full of sulfur. And so we won that class action lawsuit, but then it completely kind of dismantled our relationship. And so in the past year since the trust, I wrote to Halifax Water and was like, look, we're two of the biggest neighbors in this community. We need to be working together. And so we started basically a conversation of reconciliation. There's large steel gates that prevent public from entering the watershed area because it's a critical infrastructure site. And I'd never been through those gates, and we were invited into the gates. We toured the facility. And so we're going to be working with them, with Halifax Water, to build a resource plan for that large 900-acre tract of land in the back. So it's stuff like that that our trust is really focused on right now, so that we can get to the affordable housing piece. So that kind of gives you an idea of what we've done. Our path forward is going to be to, of course, provide affordable housing opportunities, home ownership opportunities, to bring land parcels to their highest and best use. And we also want a community, we're really focused on community planning. Our communities don't think 5, 10, 15, 30 years ahead like we should be, because we've been absent from those planning conversations with our municipality. And so that is one thing that we're very focused on, is that long range planning piece. And so we'll be able to, through that, hopefully get conveyance of parcels. Our community land trust doesn't actually own any land yet. So we're developing strategies for how to gain possession of some of those types of parcels, those colored parcels you saw in the beginning. But we have incorporated, we have been doing community consultation. Our strategic plan will be done by the end of March. And so we'll be moving into some of these midterm plans. And really our focus is, again, to build that economic stability, but really just to stabilize our community and to have that long range plan for the future. So I'll leave everyone with that, and I appreciate your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Curtis. From your story, it just really makes very crystal clear the amount of barriers that the Black community has to overcome in order to make this incredibly valued progress, right? Like wanting to build affordable housing, but first we have to address the water and the title, and there's all these barriers along the way, but still we persevere. So our next speaker is Natasha Gray from DownTheMarsh CLT. She is a community engagement consultant. Natasha Gray.
All right, thank you, Cheryl, and hello to everybody. I'm just going to share my screen as well. Okay, so we should be good there. So good afternoon. Again, my name is Natasha Gray. I am currently working with the DownTheMarsh Community Land Trust as the Community Engagement Coordinator. And I know my role is in the bio, but really I engage with the current and former residents of Cheryll and provide guidance to the transitional board. And this afternoon, I'm joining you from Mi'kma'ki. So we're in the ancestral and unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. And I also recognize that we African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched the part of Mi'kma'ki that's known as Nova Scotia, and we've been here for over 400 years. So thank you, Cheryll, thank you, Curtis, for providing that context of the history. I knew that when I joined this today, I was going to learn some new things myself. So DownTheMarsh Community Land Trust is based in Cheryll, Nova Scotia. And as you can see, Cheryll is considered the hub of Nova Scotia based upon its central location in the province. So the African Nova Scotian presence in Cheryll dates back to the first settlement by Black loyalists in the 18th century. Cheryll has 3 historic Black communities still known today as the Island, the Hill, and the Marsh. The Marsh was a thriving and vibrant Black community where residents and families own their own homes and properties. The community lived in an intimate relationship with Mother Nature and the prominent river that ran through. While they faced seasonal flooding, their resourcefulness, resiliency, and adaptability enabled them to overcome challenges. Mainstream technological advances in water management increased the desirability of the marsh to outside developers, and they began to crowd the area. Excuse me. Their developments put stress on the ecology and displaced challenges onto residents of the marsh who were not financially able to absorb the associated costs. This hardship, compounded with systemic racism, environmental racism, and discrimination, made it difficult for the residents to cope and stay in place. Consequently, residents face disposition of land and housing, loss of home, community displacement, and erasure. So this project aims to establish a Black-led community land trust for African Nova Scotians and other families who have been pushed to the margins through systemic racism, discrimination, gentrification, and the economics of inequality. The Community Land Trust will both in process and in product claim reparations in the form of land, property, community building, and intergenerational wealth. And the Marsh is the first site of the proposed Community Land Trust. So DownTheMarsh Community Land Trust was incorporated in June of 2022 and will begin with the acquisition of 6 properties currently located on Ford and Cross Streets in Cheryll. This area is historically known as the Black community called the Marsh. The zoning regulations of Cheryll allow for anywhere from 8 units on those 6 properties that you see in front of you, up to 38 units of affordable rentals and or a combination of the affordable rentals and affordable home ownership. That information will be determined by the board going forward. So the mission of the DownTheMarsh Community Land Trust is to create thriving African Nova Scotian communities by developing collectively owned land assets. And their vision is housing and community assets for building wellness, wealth, and wholeness for African Nova Scotians. And they work under the following guiding principles: is the recognition of African Nova Scotians as a distinct people. They will work with an Afrocentric lens, which means they will promote the cultural, social, and historical contributions of African Nova Scotians, and the recognition of the ongoing legacy of anti-Black racism. Collaboration, they will collaborate with key stakeholders to ensure that they implement a community-led solution. They will always focus on sustainability, and they will always work with integrity. And Housing Nova Scotia has an action plan data from 2019 to 2022, and that states that housing is more than a building. Safe, affordable, and appropriate housing is the foundation of our communities. When Nova Scotians' housing needs are met, they are healthier, happier, and more productive. And this benefits the individual and the province overall. Our communities and economy are strengthened when everyone has a place to call home. So this project is well aligned with Housing Nova Scotia's objective to improve housing outcomes for racialized and marginalized communities. And one of the goals of this community land trust is that it will directly benefit past and present African Nova Scotian families from Truro, the Colchester County area, and other parts of Nova Scotia through the security of tenure, affordable housing rental and ownership, and intergenerational inheritance opportunities. DownTheMarsh Community Land Trust is comprised of a transitional board of African Nova Scotian community members from Truro, the broader African Nova Scotian and Black communities, and others. These are our decision makers, and they govern the Community Land Trust startup. We also have an advisory group, and this group is composed of practitioners in reparations, affordable housing, community land trust, and community development. They provide advice to the transitional board and offer technical support and subject matter expert advice during the community land trust startup. Both the transitional board and the advisory group meet on a monthly basis. We also have 3 subcommittees that have been established to manage the immediate and ongoing needs of the trust startup. They meet separately from the board and the advisory group, and they bring back their recommendations to the board for approval before moving forward. So we currently have a project development committee, a human resource committee, and a finance committee. And also when it comes to supporting the work of the land trust, we have 2 master planning students from Dalhousie University that volunteer their time to work with the trust as well. So they would bring any planning or associated information that the trust would require. So as of right now, we have 3 people that are currently working with the trust. So we have myself as the community engagement consulting. And as I spoke before, I was contracted to lead that community engagement piece. And we also have an operational development consultant. So she completes all the appropriate research related to community land trust and advises the board on the operational and strategic planning, including the development of the bylaws. And she is also working on a business plan for the trust going forward. And we have an administrative coordinator who also provides that administrative support to the trust as needed. So as we know, community land trusts are controlled by the community. And our focus is we have hosted 2 in-person community engagement sessions so far. And we have our 3rd engagement session scheduled for the 27th of February. And the goal of these sessions are to really share the background and the foundation of what a community land trust is. We talk about what affordable housing means to the residents in Truro. And of course, we know Truro's less than Halifax, actually, when it comes to vacancy rates, and really what that impact has on the community. So we aim to gather as much feedback and first voice perspectives as possible for all those community members. And we're also collecting information in the form of a community survey that has gone out to every member of the community that we could think of, to collect the information, because we're trying to develop a community profile and the demographics really of what our community looks like. And all this information will be used to inform the strategic planning and the business plan of the trust. And that's it for me. Thank you. And we have a email set up, which is dtmcommunityengagement@gmail.com if anyone wanted to reach out to us.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. Again, seeing that these communities are pushing forward to build solutions.
Okay, well, hello everyone. My name is Jacka Blay and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm the executive director of Hogan's Alley Society. I'm a guest on the unceded and occupied ancestral lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Stolo, and Musqueam nations, known colonially as Vancouver. And I'm excited to talk about Hogan's Alley Land Trust here in Vancouver. So Hogan's Alley Society, our mission is to advance the social, political, economic, and cultural well-being of people of African descent through the delivery of inclusive housing, built spaces, and culturally informed programming and operations. So similar to the previous presenters, I also want to start with some history about the area. So what was Hogan's Alley? Hogan's Alley was the unofficial name for a T-shaped intersection at the southwestern edge of Strathcona neighborhood that formed the nucleus of Vancouver's first concentrated Black community in the early 1900s. At its peak in about the 1940s, Hogan's Alley was home to more than 800 Black community members. There were several reasons the Black community of Vancouver clustered in this area, including the prevalence of affordable housing, proximity to the railroads where many Black men worked as sleeping car porters, and the restriction of racialized people from settling in other parts of the city due to institutionalized racism. Hogan's Alley was a tight-knit community of laborers, entrepreneurs, and families. It included Black cultural institutions such as chicken house restaurants, which were often doubled as speakeasies. The heart of the community was the African Methodist Episcopal Fountain Chapel, the only Black church in Vancouver at the time. And 50 years ago, racist public policies, the urban renewal schemes, and the construction of the Georgia and Dunsmuir viaducts displaced this diverse immigrant enclave and dispersed the Black community. This displacement contributed to the lack of visibility and cohesion for Black community members in the following decades and even today. The Black community has historically been marginalized and disenfranchised by housing developments across the country, leading to intergenerational poverty and lack of opportunities to build wealth through home ownership. The urban renewal, which I mentioned, destroyed Black ownership and intergenerational wealth, and this was actually led by CMHC, who imported it from the United States, and CMHC has admitted to playing a role in the forced resettlement of Black people who lived in Hogan's Alley, as well as in Africville in Nova Scotia. So this history is important because it helps explain our current situation. In 2015, the City of Vancouver began consultations to inform the development of the Northeast False Creek plan based on a decision to remove the Georgia and Dunsmuir viaducts. So this area here that's highlighted in blue is what's referred to as the Northeast Falls Creek. And the Hogan's Alley block is here, or up here in this picture. And this over here, you can see the surrounded by the yellow box is kind of a mock-up of potential development for that block. Community groups such as Hogan's Alley Memorial Project, who've been working to raise awareness of the history of the Black community in Hogan's Alley, as well as other community members, challenged the fact that the city wasn't acknowledging the history of this Black community in their planning for the Northeast Falls Creek redevelopment. So the city formed the Hogan's Alley Working Group to consult Black community members and to inform the development of the Northeast Falls Creek plan. Through the advocacy of the working group, the Northeast Falls Creek plan was the first plan in North America to speak explicitly to cultural redress, specifically for Indigenous, Chinese, and Black communities. So here you can see pictures of the Hogan's Alley Working Group charrette process, which really gathered input from community members on what the development should look like. The idea of a community land trust was brought forward by community members, and the Hogan's Alley Land Trust Group began exploring this feasibility of this initiative. What began as the exploration of building an African diaspora cultural center expanded into pushing for a community land trust on the Hogan's Alley block as redress for the displacement of the Black community. The working group pulled together a set of guiding principles, which are intended to inform any developments on the block. So these include recognition, an authentic and just course of recognition of the collective contribution of Black Canadian identity, both historical and contemporary, honoring, so to honor the Black community that lived in Hogan's Alley by celebrating them while nurturing and developing the contributions of our contemporary Black community. Access and inclusion. So this will be a space that creates access by unlocking resources, reshaping markets, and generating equitable opportunities for all people, and provides the necessary stability to build assets in community. Then there's security of tenure and our definition of land use. Really, this is about zoning of this development will provide long-term and self-determined security of land tenure that guards against the possibility of forced displacement and is also mindful of the urban fabric that is integrating with us as to promote this same value. And then finally, investment. This land will be seen as an investment in community. It'll support the Black community in rebuilding the strong social networks that were lost and generationally entrenched, while recognizing that cultural and demographic diversity creates unique needs in our community. So the development on the Hogan's Alley block will deliver a Black cultural center. It'll contribute significantly to the 300 units of housing that are meant to be delivered as part of the Northeast Falls Creek plan. It'll include social housing and below market rentals, as well as space for small businesses, nonprofits, and childcare. Hogan's Alley Society was formed as an organization in 2017 to move forward with advocacy and negotiations with the city, and really to move forward with the initiative of the Community Land Trust. Over 4 years of negotiations were led by a volunteer board of individuals who demonstrated immense leadership, such as Stephanie Allen, June Francis, and Amina Yassine, among to name a few. And this journey went through many starts and stops, required grit and determination, and the confronting of systemic and overt anti-Black racism. In September 2022, Hogan's Alley Society announced that we had signed a memorandum of understanding with the City of Vancouver, which lays out the parameters to negotiate a long-term lease for the 898 Main Street block, also referred to as Hogan's Alley block. As part of our commitment to honoring the legacy of Black Strathcona residents, we're envisioning a space within the city that highlights the contributions of the former inhabitants of Hogan's Alley and adds to the vibrant multicultural milieu of Vancouver. The development, to move forward with the development, a key part of which being the Black Cultural Center, will be engaging with community in helping us develop the vision to serve the unique needs and desires of people of African descent in Metro Vancouver. So I joined Hogan's Alley Society just in August 2022 as the first executive director for the organization. And we have a volunteer board as well as a growing team of staff. We're currently 4 that are helping to advance various areas of work. So in addition to the Community Land Trust, the Hogan's Alley Society is also advancing 3 other areas of work, including housing, research, and community building. In terms of housing, we're in a tripartite agreement with BC Housing and Atira Property Management to operate Nora Hendricks Place, which is a 52-unit temporary modular social housing development on the Hogan's Alley block. Nora Hendricks Place prioritizes Black and Indigenous folks who are seeking to exit homelessness. And we're currently being mentored by Atira so that our organization can take over operations of Nora Hendricks Place. This is complemented by our community care program, which provides more kind of wraparound culturally informed supports for the Nora Hendricks Place residents, as well as other community members through cultural support programs, a gardening program, as well as housing support, where we're able to provide we're able to address emergency housing needs for community members. We're also working on research and advocacy. Our big initiative out right now is our Black Housing Solutions Lab, funded by CMHC, where we are exploring the housing needs of Black community members in Metro Vancouver and developing solutions for those. We currently have a survey out, if you know anyone living in the area, focused on rental housing. And then finally, community building. We really want to be convening Black communities to support community building, leverage our community efforts, and engage in a community vision, partnering with various organizations and individuals so that, and activating the area around Hogan's Alley so that once we have the built development, Black community members are already feeling drawn to the area. So Hogan's Alley was once the heart of the Black community and a hopeful multiracial and multi-ethnic community in the heart of Vancouver. And this project will ensure that it will be once again. We'd love to connect with you. So you can reach out to us through our email or at any of our social channels and sign up for a newsletter on our website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaka. Wonderful presentation, very, very inspiring. The ability for the Hogan's Alley to get that land deal, when the news came out, I definitely shared it with a bunch of folks in my networks just to see, what we could strive for in terms of redress. And so redress, for folks who might not be familiar with the term, is a term that actually comes from the space of human rights and of justice. It is where a group has been harmed by a system, and so the system then takes action to address that harm, to create good, to support the communities that they had harmed. So, the Black communities have been systemically kept out of opportunities and had their experiences denied and had their ownership of property prevented from having that ownership or having that ownership removed or not acknowledged. And so redress for that is incredibly important to enable us to build the infrastructure and support that we need and that we would have had access to if we had not been victim to anti-Black racism, right? Because we are very capable, as you can see from the presenters today. We can start off with some questions, perhaps. So I hope folks have been thinking about your question that you'd like to ask the panel, if you can drop them in the chat, any questions that you would have.
Oh, this is from Brian from the Federation of Black Canadians. He says, maybe a long-term question. Will there be an opportunity for groups on this call to consider a national partnership as one group to acquire, develop, and sell units if we work with Black families across the country?
Any of the panelists like to respond to that question?
I can add something here. I think, you know, there's been some development in terms of connecting some of our organizations across the nation. I think, you know, in Nova Scotia, we had just been so focused, I think, on our own province for a long time. And I think the same is true perhaps in other, you know, Black communities in Canada. But after the Black Summit, it kind of put a number of us in contact with one another, like Cheryl and Jaka and some of us, Nat. We've been able to connect, and I think that's really for us. It has really broadened our perspective, and I think it has a number of us thinking about just that, like exactly how can we, you know, I guess perhaps have a collection or a coalition or some type of more galvanized partnership across the province or across there I go again, across the country. So, you know, we're definitely thinking about that more now, I think, because we're broadening our connections, or at least that's my understanding. So I don't think something like that is necessarily off the table, but would be something that would happen, I think, like you say, farther into the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the building blocks for that are definitely here, and we're working on it, right? Because it's going to be a long haul to get to that point where we're able to have that infrastructure to implement that development. So I see a question in the chat from Stacy. How receptive of for-profit housing developers are you guys to this idea? Or how receptive are for-profit housing developers to this idea? What is the challenge with getting developers on board? How have you gotten them on board? If so, or how are those conversations going? Are you having those conversations at all? Thank you, Stacey, for the question.
I guess I can share a bit in that we have been in conversations with different developers. There have been actually, you know, some relationships that have been developed. So like it varies on the developer, but ultimately we're working to be seen as a stakeholder that community needs to be taking seriously in the development of Vancouver. And, you know, ultimately we want to be sitting down at those same tables with large developers to be pushing for change in our community. And so that's part of the work. Is part of it is working together, and part of it is also, you know, being acknowledged as important players in the city. And thanks to lots of hard work from our board members over the years, there has been pretty significant recognition of Hogan's Alley Society, and we need to continue to build on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Jaka. And so I'm wondering, so in building out relationships with developers and even the private sector, right? So we need a volume of support to see these models come to fruition. So public support in terms of government funding. Are there other ways that you're looking at supporting for the funding of these models of affordable housing? This is a general question to the panel.
I can chime in on that. And to Jacques' point about the about developers, I mean, in our community, our relationship with developers has been contentious, right? So I think it's it's kind of two things, because the community, you know, there's this stigma in our community because there's so much development that's happening without any community input, right? So because there's as of right use, we just see a clear cutting, and then all of a sudden there's a Facebook flyer for this new development that's coming to the community, which has no cultural context. But we have been able to have a few conversations with some of the developers in the community, which have been really positive. And so we're trying to focus on that and trying to see what relationships we can build with some of the developers in our community, and looking outside our community to some of the developers that are working with some of the other Black-led organizations in our proximity, to see if we can build a better relationship when it comes to developers. In terms of funders outside of the province, we have been working with the credit union and starting to have conversations there. And they're willing to really think outside the box in terms of, funding some of our projects as well. We're also, there's like foundations. So we were investigating, charitable partnerships, perhaps with our church, or other, charitable organizations.
So credit unions, definitely, I've seen a lot of credit unions being involved in all different types of models for affordable housing development. So it's no surprise that they would be an ally here as well. I think that the point you're bringing up around contention with developers is an incredibly important one, right? Because the system that we're dealing with, developers, although they do have challenges to contend with in terms of going through the process, there's a lot of privileges and access that they do have, right? And for them to share that privilege and access, for us to trust that they will do so and not, just make benefit out of our situation, requires a lot of relationship building and trust building over time, to totally understand that approach. So I'm seeing another question here in the chat. This is more for the Canadian Network for CLT in general, but the panel can answer too. Have you connected to or looked at CLTs in other countries? I think very well the panel can answer this question. So have you looked into CLT models in other countries as inspiration for you in your process of establishing your land trust in your community?
Well, I can start. I know that our board members previously actually went down to the States to visit some land trusts down there. And that's something that we're hoping to continue. But I'll just give a plug here to there is an effort to connect community land trusts, Black-led community land trusts across the country, so that we can be learning from each other and supporting each other, and maybe having some collective advocacy to government. So Curtis has been leading the charge on that quite a bit, and Cheryll as well. And so I think it's important for us to be collaborating on those fronts, and we're also looking at connecting with in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
And I can add to that a bit. I don't know if any of our board members have necessarily traveled, but we've been doing a lot of research, and with our operational development consultant, because we are trying to make sure that we embed that Afrocentric lens in all our policies and bylaws and plans going forward. Because really, like, as we're learning here, is this is more of a new initiative across Canada. So anything that we're looking at that would have that Black-led foundation would be outside of Canada at this point. We're looking at the research, trying to get the information. So I would say yes, we've certainly, there's been a lot of information coming out of the United States that we're trying to pull some information out of there. So we're very excited about the network and the research being available within Canada going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we're definitely developing a lot of rich research and examples here. Gosh, I would love to hear more about this Afrocentric lens and how you've taken those learnings and applied that in Down the Marsh. What is it Afrocentric lens?
Well, it's interesting you say that because there's a lot of debate on that. So our focus is that we always want to make sure that we are community minded, right? And I know our board chair, Dr. Jones, she's on the call, so I don't want to speak for her. She might want to chime in, but I know that we always work for that community focus, right? So we're thinking about when we grew up and everything was based on community. We talk about, you know, the African proverb, how it takes a community to raise a child, right? We want to have that focus. We always want to look to make sure that we're looking at it with that, that we don't want to be discriminatory. We want to make sure that all our policies have Black-led focus within them, embedded in them. We want to make sure that our boards are representative of our community, and that we're hearing a lot about people saying when they come to the land trust, they want to be able to drive down the street and be able to see people that look like them. So we always want to make sure that is our focus going forward, and that we embed all that Afrocentric policies. And I know I keep coming back to that, but we want that community, we want that family, we want that lifestyle back of when you learn those histories from your auntie across the table, when you had those focus of the whole community coming together.
Yeah, community is a really incredibly important part of the community land trust model. And so sometimes, you know, even in community, even in family, things can sometimes be messy. You need to have structure in place, and you also need to be having community leaders in place who know how to support, manage, and develop these really incredibly important relationships. So in terms of the management of the CLT, what are the processes that you apply to manage the CLT and support for folks to see themselves reflected in its management? I'd love to hear from you. I think, Natasha, I've been plugging on you a bit consistently now. Maybe we'll move on to somebody else. Maybe Curtis or Jaka.
Sure, I can speak to it from a I guess a theory, because the thing about and I advocate for this a lot, is that in Nova Scotia we have a lot of grassroots, you know, momentum building, like Down the Marsh, like Upper Hammonds Plains. There's a number of grassroots organizations, but we don't work inside of our organizations, right? So we're doing these things as volunteers. A lot of the work that we are putting in is as of volunteers. And so there's a significant lack of capacity when we don't have the investment in our organizations to be able to work inside of them. And so when you're thinking about, and like to my friends at the United Way, who I talk to, you know, in depth about these types of things, is that, you know, we're trying to set up a real estate investment company as basically a side piece of what we're already doing day to day, right? Which is substantial. Like when you really think about that, it's you're up against it, right? So I think when we start to be able to have capacity inside of our organizations to have full-time staff, which is going to be the goal, one of the goals of our trust in this new year, we'll see significant amount of movement there. And then we want to have capacity, you know, built within these different types of professions, like property management. We're understanding now that planning is a huge piece. One of the most important pieces that you know, we hadn't considered, or at least our community hadn't been considering. And you know, and then that spills into architecture and, you know, environmental assessments, and being able to do resource management for large pieces of property with mature forests, right? Like, how do we harvest the timber and the topsoil in the most effective manner? Like, those are all things that we, you know, didn't realize that we really need to have expertise in, surveying, all of these types of areas. So that's why, you know, we're really trying to pitch also at the same time that we really need to build capacity in some of these areas and expertise, and try to, you know, bring some of the knowledge that exists in our Black community across Canada here, to be able to deploy some of that and, you know, share that information so we can build, you know, build our sector, our community housing sector with these types of professionals that can do these types of services.
Thank you so much to Curtis Wiley from the Upper for your leadership to Natasha Gray for your leadership, and to Jaka as well for your leadership. It is incredibly inspiring to see what we are pushing forward to build. So thank you so much, and wonderful to have Nat and the Canadian Network for Community Land Trust host this conversation, and to bring acknowledgement to the work that Black communities are doing. This Black History Month is not just about understanding our pains and the barriers that we've come across. It's about acknowledging that the work is being put in to build a better future. So thank you so much to the Canadian Land Trust, a Canadian Network of Land Trusts, and thank you so much to everybody who's been here today to hear this presentation. I hope you do feel inspired and do think about and reflect on how we can support these groups to accomplish their goals of protecting Black communities and Black culture through community-owned housing. And with that, thank you so much. Have a great day.